As a teenager, I lived in St. Augustine, Florida, about 2 blocks away from the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. Absolutely huge place. So the deaf students were always in the neighborhood. We were playing basketball and sharing skateboards and hanging out at 7-Eleven and all of that. And I became accustomed of the way my friends communicated with signs and with sound. And I used to be able to sign myself, but super slow now. It's like math or a foreign language. If you don't use it, it's gone. You lose it. And I remember becoming a little bit maybe aggressive when the neighborhood kids would make fun of my friends because of the way they tried to speak. Unfortunately, back in 1966, people thought it was okay to make fun of my deaf friends, so I got into 1 or 2 or 3 or so altercations with the rest of the kids. And sometimes I got the impression that my deaf friends were being jerked around and treated unfairly. For example, a deaf student at 7-Eleven goes to the counter with an unpriced item, and the clerk knows he's deaf because he can see him using sign. He can hear the sounds that he's communicating with. So the clerk rings up the sale, and at the top of his lungs, he yells, $2, like he can make the kid hear. And he does this a few times. He's holding up 2 fingers going, $2, $2. And the young man can see the cash register. It says $2. He can read. But by now, every person in the place who's not deaf is looking at my embarrassed friend because the clerk has made the mistake, once again, of thinking that deaf means stupid. You'd be surprised at how much that exists even today. Kentucky Fried Chicken Company a month ago had to have sensitivity training because some employees were making fun of deaf people. As hard as it seemed to be for deaf people when I was a teenager, even more so back in Jesus' day, where there were no powerful hearing aids or medical procedures. American Sign Language wasn't developed until 1817. So Jesus knew how hard it was for this deaf man. He took him aside, and with tender consideration, he talked to him, and he was aware of the feelings of a man whose life was very, very difficult. He showed compassion, treating the man with dignity, not just a problem to be solved, took him away, wasn't going to use him as a showcase healing out in public. And then Jesus becomes physically involved. I mean, why? I mean, all he needs to do is wish it. All he needs to do is snap his fingers. This guy would be healed. But this man had a special need, and Jesus interacted with him in a way that he could understand. Jesus uses specific actions to prepare the man, to get him ready, to allow him to expect something to happen, to let him expect and hope that there's going to be healing. Jesus touched his ears, indicating to the man that something's about to happen here in this part of your body. He's spitting. He's touching the man's tongue, showing that he should expect something to happen there as well. Jesus looked up to heaven to show the man it was from God that help was going to come. I mean, he didn't need to do all this. I mean, people were being healed just by touching the hem of his garment. But Jesus used this physical method of speaking to communicate to the man how healing was going to come about. It was a way of communicating that would awaken the man's faith to an expectation of healing. If he was going to be encouraged at all, it had to be by touch. So he's touching his ears, he's touching his tongue, he's looking up, he's groaning. Jesus is totally focused on this man with everything he's got. And as it all comes together, he says loudly in Aramaic, "Be opened." And the deaf man is healed and begins to speak. So naturally, Jesus tells him to be quiet. Go figure. Don't tell anybody. The encounter with Christ profoundly changed this man. No one can have an encounter with Christ and walk away unchanged. Nobody. So he couldn't hold it in. He couldn't keep quiet. His brain would explode. He had to tell somebody. The good news of the gospel is not simply that Jesus is somebody who can heal. The miracles, the healing of this deaf man, are signs of the salvation he brings, even today. A sign of God's presence with us. So how does this gospel relate to us today, specifically? In two ways. First, through our baptism, we are responsible for continuing what Christ began, bringing back the beauty and healing of God to a world that sort of leans towards chaos right now. And we do that by doing what Jesus told us to do. And you've heard this 1,000 times. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So simple. One way we do that is when we do what the deaf man's friends did when they begged Jesus to lay hands on him. And that's when you pray for other people. You take them to Christ in prayer and ask Christ to lay hands on them. Friends, families, strangers, victims of natural disasters and abuse and whatever else. Like the deaf man's friends, you initiate that. You get that ball rolling. The second way the gospel relates to us. Don't think for a moment he doesn't want to touch us too, just like the deaf man. Don't think for a second that he doesn't want to encounter us and to heal us too, if he can reach us. Just like with the deaf man, he will interact with you in a way that you can understand if you let him. This gospel reminds us not to be God deaf. He speaks to you in your hearts, where your conscience lives. If we are God deaf, we're not going to hear anything. And we're certainly not going to say anything or share anything about him. And sometimes I think the world is going a little bit God deaf. You know, if a homeless man dies on the sidewalk downtown tonight, it's not going to make the headlines. Not anymore. If 300 people somewhere, 300 children in the world today starve, that's about normal, isn't it? If we separate toddlers from their mothers by force, that's no big deal, is it? I wonder if in our hearts humanity is going a little God deaf, the same way a child goes mother deaf. How many moms do we have here? Go ahead, raise your hands, moms. Bunches. We got bunches of moms. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? You could tell a child one time, do this, child, do it. But pretty soon, you're telling this child 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. You even get down to the timeout, countdown. 1, 2, 3, and then maybe the child responds. As a parent myself, I think mother deaf starts around 2.5 years old, and then it repeats around 13 years old, at least in my family. Now, if we get frustrated when our kids go mother deaf and father deaf, imagine God's reaction. Imagine Jesus' reaction when we go God deaf. And if we go God deaf, we're probably going to go God blind. A way to avoid going God deaf and God blind is to see God's presence around you and be part of it. Don't just look at it. Just don't go, oh yeah, there it is, oh, okay. Be part of it. See God's presence in the people around us, in the random acts of kindness that you see, in those who forgive us when we most need it, in the food people bring here and put into the big carts here, in the faces of the people that you meet on the street. If we want to experience Christ's presence and be part of it, we must open both the eyes and the ears of our hearts. If we watch carefully, if we listen closely, we will feel his presence and hear him as he touches our hearts and says, Ephphatha, be open.